with favorable terms and conditions of employment. In the United States, I was informed that the PNAA, together with other stakeholders, has closely worked with our polo to draft policy proposals on addressing issues on burdensome provisions in their employment agreements. Rest assured that we will continue to exert efforts to improve the lives of our Filipino nurses through policies and programs to enhance your employability, secure your rights, and facilitate your professional mobility through ethical and fair recruitment process, and international recognition of your qualifications, skills, and competencies. So let me close by conveying my admiration to our Filipino nurses. The profession you have chosen is a difficult one. It is not only about administering medicines, taking vital signs, or assisting in treating patients. It is also about taking responsibility over other people's lives. I am sure you get plenty of satisfaction and fulfillment at the thought that you are helping people and you are touching many lives. Mabuhay po tayong lahat. Mabuhay po ang ating mga Filipino nurses.
Undersecretary Arellano, and you have heard the message from the Secretary Bello. The first one is nursing salaries, that they are going to be compensated accordingly, and most importantly, we have nursing students here. There will be no training fees. If you would like to gain experience in a hospital or a healthcare facility, there will be no training fees. That has already come directly from Undersecretary Arellano, from Secretary Bello. So thank you very much, Undersecretary Arellano, for making it clear to all of us the two things that are most important to our nurses in the Philippines: salary and training. Our ability to get training without spending $30,000 or more. Okay, now what happens after next that we have heard this keynote is now the specificity of what Undersecretary Arellano has talked about. This is about contracts, this is about employment agreements, this is about termination, this is about breach fees if you go on early termination. So we'd like to call on Attorney Mukul Bakshi to moderate the panel discussion and to introduce to you Attorney Bakshi. Attorney Bakshi is actually the Director of Alliance for Ethical International Recruitment Practices that is aligned with the CGFNS, or the Commission on Graduates of Foreign Nursing Schools. So I would like to introduce Attorney Bakshi, who has been instrumental in actually working with us with what Undersecretary Arellano talked about. We gave him the proposed provisions on termination and breach on employment agreement.
Good afternoon. I know after lunch, the best thing to have is 4 lawyers talking for the next hour, so thank you for bearing with us. We have a really interesting topic we're about to address, which is this new paradigm for the recruitment of nurses. And that's just an interesting phrasing, right? You know, my background is as director of the Alliance, and the Alliance for Ethical International Recruitment Practices was founded just over a decade ago. In the mid-2000s, they did a study, a multi-stakeholder group that included the PNAA, employers, recruiters, and unions, and said, what is going on with all these nurses coming over? And they found a wide array of experiences, some very, very positive, and others with much more problematic issues, including phasing switches in contracts, changing of contracts after Filipino nurse gets in the U.S., holding of passports and other documents, and high breach fees if a nurse leaves employment for whatever reason. From that, they said, all right, what do we do about it? They came up with a code of ethical recruitment. In the absence of regulatory response, how do we get actors to work? And so the Alliance, many of the people actually in this room helped develop the code that says, how should recruitment work in an ideal world? And that code was adopted, and the Alliance was created to certify recruitment firms that agreed to apply under that code. The Alliance became a division of CGF&S International in 2014. For those of you who are not aware, CGF&S does the credential evaluation services. If you're a Filipino nurse going to the United States, maybe for your employment visa, you need verification that your nursing education is good. Or maybe for a state license, you need that kind of thing to say that the nursing education received in the Philippines is equivalent to what you would need to practice in Maryland, or California, or New Jersey. And so if you look at the CGF&S as enabling nurses to bring the human capital, the knowledge they have with them, the Alliance is the flip side of that, making sure that they're treated fairly and ethically when they come over. So what does this all have to do with professional mobility? Professional mobility is a different way of thinking about what we would used to call foreign recruitment. It's really about empowering the nurse to make the decisions around their career that they need to for their families, for themselves, for their professional development. And despite concerns about the brain drain and the need for healthcare in places like the Philippines and other developing countries, it's really about balancing the needs of the country from which they came and they're trained, the country they're going to, and their own rights to make sure that they have a living that they feel comfortable with. Despite the Alliance, there have been obstacles to professional mobility that kind of remain and persist. I mean, if some of this is necessary, the visa process, credential evaluation, but most importantly, even when nurses are able to be mobile, they're in a position where they're very vulnerable. The first issue is a power imbalance. There's always a power imbalance between employers and employees. The employer has the job, the employee needs the job. There's also information asymmetry. The employer knows more about what the job will entail than the employee does. Both of these are much worse for the foreign nurse who has to worry about losing their visa if they leave the job, or high breach fees even if they're treated poorly in the job. And that leads to all kinds of problems. So there's contract switching, as I said, breach fees, baits and switches in terms of assignments. And so the Alliance launched a new code last September, updating the situation for the modern era. But what has happened since then is we've realized that more needs to be done. And so the PNAA has been instrumental in convening a task force to develop new provisions that were just mentioned. In meetings with Undersecretary Olalia and Secretary Bello, there is a commitment by the Department of Labor to adopt provisions on termination and breach that protect the principle of fair and free employment while also ensuring that contracts are valid. The hope is that a new paradigm of professional mobility that protects all stakeholders, the recruiter, the employer, and the nurse themselves, and protects nurses from fundamentally unfair contracts. And so I think it's a very powerful tool that we're looking to do, because professional mobility should be about choice and freedom, and not about being trapped in things that look like indentured servitude.
We are the United States' largest legal services nonprofit focused on Asian Americans. And I work primarily with victims of human trafficking, of labor trafficking, who are Filipino. So some, but not all of them, are nurses. And I've also studied Filipino nursing immigration pretty extensively in the past. So next slide, please. But more importantly, I'm the son of a nurse, and my mom, she came to New York in 1982 with about a dozen other Filipinas. She went through a recruitment agency and ended up working at a Catholic hospital that's now closed in Queens called Mary Immaculate. And she actually met my dad through my tita, who was also working at the same hospital. So I can say that I would not have been born without nursing migration, really. And that's my mom. I don't know if you can see the symbol, but that's her in the bottom right corner over there. Yeah. So next slide, please. So I don't think it's possible to really fully understand the obstacles and issues that we face today without understanding the history of nursing migration from the Philippines. And if any of you have time, I recommend reading one of my favorite books, Empire of Care by Catherine Simson-Choi, who's a professor of ethnic studies at UC Berkeley. And in this book, she basically explains how when the Philippines was a U.S. colony, American officials very intentionally replicated American-style healthcare in the Philippines, and that really set the stage for the nursing migration from the Philippines that followed in the decades to come, specifically after independence. So next slide, please. Back, please. So hopefully the audio will work, but here's actually a short video that explains a little bit as to what happened after independence. So let's give this a try. I was going to say, it actually is a video that's available on AJ Plus, which is a subsidiary of Al Jazeera, I believe. It explains just how after independence, the United States actually piloted or began an exchange visitor program, which still exists in some form today. And one of the biggest groups of participants in that program were Filipino nurses. And the Philippines really became, it was part of the Cold War efforts to sort of elevate capitalism in the face of communism. And the Philippines really became a model for that exchange program that was then extended to lots of other countries, and then led to the permanent outflow of many Filipino nurses to the United States in the decades that followed. All right, next slide, please. So as you all know, migration abroad is a major, if not the primary focus of nursing education and training here in the Philippines. Developed countries all over the world are experiencing nursing shortages, and the Philippines, for the most part, is their primary source of nurses. For better or worse, most nursing graduates in the Philippines plan to move abroad. I think it's pretty shocking that at UP Manila, in one survey, only 2% of nursing students said that they plan to stay in the Philippines for their careers. Even at a place like UP Manila, it's very nationalist and has very strong advocacy among the faculty for local service. Overall, the Philippines produces a net surplus of nurses, and it actually is this oversupply that's so large that some think that even migration abroad is not enough to absorb it. So in other words, there are some people that are not going to be able to move abroad as nurses, and they won't necessarily even be able to work as nurses here in the Philippines. Next slide, please. So this figure here, you can see the destinations that many Filipino nurses go to around the world, and it's a little bit misleading because you can see that Saudi Arabia represents a big chunk, a majority of these nurses, but I should say that this represents nurses who are going abroad on temporary contracts. So even though it looks like Saudi Arabia is the primary destination for Filipino nurses, for many it's seen as just a temporary transit point on their way to other places, specifically the US and to a lesser extent Canada and Europe. And in many cases nurses will go to Saudi Arabia and other countries in the Middle East as they wait for their visas to the US and other countries to get processed. Next slide, please. The United States, despite that last slide, continues to be the most important destination for Filipino nurses. And you can see that among foreign educated nurses in the US, that's about 6% of the nursing workforce, Filipinos make up the majority of foreign educated nurses. Next slide, please. So the demand for nurses in the U.S., it continues to be the primary driver of the overproduction of nurses in the Philippines. And increasingly, foreign educated nurses represent an increasing share of the nursing workforce in the U.S. In particular, California and New York are home to a plurality of foreign educated nurses. Next slide. And one trend that I think many of you may be aware of is that recently the opportunity to move abroad as nurses has affected physicians as well. And increasingly many doctors in the
United States, and certainly this exists beyond the United States, turns out there's a great model to follow to transform nursing, specifically nursing. Okay? And this would be the magnet model, and I want to dive into that a little bit more. Okay, so in the objectives, I talked about structural empowerment. Structural empowerment. Why is that? Because you smoking something, because that doesn't make any sense. Okay, so it turns out in business, in any industry, there are only 4 dimensions of a business. So whether you're a nurse in a hospital, whether you're a plumber, whether you're an electrician, your business, if you're running one, has 4 dimensions. Okay? There's a quality dimension for the work you're doing, and there's some degree of quality. There's a customer satisfaction dimension where you look at whether or not people are satisfied with the work that's being done. There's a financial dimension where there's an exchange of money and service. Okay? And then there's a work culture piece where a lot of people think that's just about morale and how happy you are doing your job, but I would argue it also includes how well read are you? Are you up on the latest parts of your science? Are you pursuing formal education and better degrees? Are you finding ways to advance in your career? And so, if you can subscribe with me that there are 4 dimensions to a hospital or to a private practice, there are only 4, okay? Do you have regular places where you come together to talk about the things that are important in each one of those buckets? Okay? So no doubt if you're in a hospital, there are quality-related issues that you run into every day. People fall, they have skin issues, there's all sorts of quality measures that are important to track. Are there places that
Director of the Migrant Heritage Commission. I've had the privilege of working with the task force to develop provisions of termination of breach. And really, he's an expert on talking about the next topic, which is legal rights of the nurse on employment and recruitment. Please help me introduce Arnedo Valera.
Oops, magandang hapon po sa inyo lahat. Alam niyo, married ako sa isang registered na nurse, certified from Davao. In fact, kakakasal ko lang noong December 2 sa Davao. And as usual, yung advice ng isang nurse na wife, sabi niya, Arnedo, punta mo sa Pilipinas, iwasan mo ang dinuguan, iwasan mo ang crispy pata, iwasan mo ang laing. Sabi ko sa wife ko, huwag kang mag-alala, Beth, kasi yung lahi namin umaabot ng 123 years old. So sabi ko, paano nangyari? Ano ginagawa ng lahi niyo? Sabi ko, mind your own business. Ayun tuloy, nag-iisa ako nag-impake papunta rito. But anyway, first, let me acknowledge the presence of the Philippine National Police Superintendent, Major Kimberly Muritas, and likewise PNP Superintendent as well, Inspector Chelly Asuay. She's also a registered nurse, and delegations from the Intergovernmental Organization and the registration right here. In his State of the Nation address, President Barack Obama hailed a Filipino nurse as a role model. And in the audience were members of the U.S. Congress. 33 million Americans were watching from their homes, and they all heard what President Obama said. We should follow the example of New York City nurse Mencho Sanchez, Filipino nurse. When Hurricane Sandy plunged her hospital into darkness, she wasn't thinking about her own home, but her mind was on the 20 precious newborns in her care and the rescue plan she devised that kept them all safe. And at that moment, Menchu became the symbol of all overseas Filipino nurses, including the 200,000 based in the US. And all over the world, Filipino nurses are in demand because of their high standard of professionalism and their warm, loving care. Now today, ang ating bansa po ang largest exporters of nurses globally, supplying about 25% of all overseas nurses working in over 50 countries. They serve also as ambassadors of goodwill. And because they enhance the Philippines people-to-people relations in the US, which is the major ally of our country. And let us not forget the major financial contribution in the Philippine economy and nation building. The annual remittance of $1 billion overseas helps the economy. Yes. Kaya palakpakan po natin ang overseas Filipinos. And alam natin na ang nurses, they also provide medical missions. And I just would like to take this opportunity, sana isama niyo po sa dasal ang mga namatay in January 20 na composed of 7 Filipino doctors and nurses from New York and Chicago na na-aksidente po sa Cebu. Papunta po sila sa Camiguin Island para mag-render ng medical mission. And of course, we would like also to tell you na ang Philippine Nurses Association of America ay nagbigay din po sila ng declaration of support sa drug rehabilitation program ni President Duterte. Ngayon po, ang ating tatalakayin ay yung tinatawag nating invincible chain of liquidated damages. No? Ito yung kumbaga sa Tagalog, bayad pinsala. So ito po yung nilalaman ng contract. Papatulong lang ako siguro. Mr. Robles, tulungan mo lang. Ito pa lang. So, yung nakikita niyo po dito, by the way, incidentally, meron po akong pinrepare na booklet research. Yung iba meron dyan kasi may iksing panahon lang po na ibigay sa akin. So hopefully, you will find that research booklet as a reference. And if you have any questions, you can call the PNAA and the Migrant Heritage Commission. Ito po ang kadalasang laman ng kontrata ng mga nurses na pumupunta sa Amerika. No? So, kung makikita natin, yung duration ng contract ng isang nurse ay 3 to 5 years. In other words, hindi ka pwedeng umalis sa employer mo until ma-complete mo yung 3 to 5 years. Ngayon, if you decide to terminate your contract or you are able to fulfill that contract, meron pong kapalit. Yun ang tinatawag nating liquidated damages. Bayad pinsala. Na umaabot hanggang 30,000 at tignan niyo po yan, nakalagay dyan, for loss of profit caused by employer being unable to fulfill the contract to provide the employee services to be designated. No? So, yung 30,000, umaabot po yan ng 50,000. Pero alam po natin na ang contract, kung ano yung karapatan at obligasyon ng employer, yun din dapat at karapatan at obligasyon ng isang nurse na na-employ sa isang facility o sa isang hospital. No? May digress lang ako ng konti, kaya kanina, kahapon ini-interview ako tungkol sa Rappler. No? Sabi ko, Ang Rappler, karapatan niya ng press freedom. Pero may obligasyon pang sumunod sa saligang batas, di ba? So, ganun din sa mga kontrata na nandito, no? Ang tanong dyan, paano kung ang employer naman ang nag-breach ng contract? Meron ba siyang hahabuling damages? Wala yan sa kontrata. So, hindi patas yung kontrata at hindi patas yung tinatawag natin karapatan at obligasyon in both ends. Kaya doon sa meeting namin ng Philippine Nurses Association of America headed by our President Dino Doliente and Vicky Navarro, we went through in details with the Undersecretary of Labor and Ms. Sec Bello, isang kaibigan, to discuss itong context ng liquidated damages. Sa aming pananaw, ito yung karanasan namin sa Amerika, yung mga kaso namin na halos ganito, na umiiyak ang nurses referred by the Philippine Nurses Association of America kasi yung context na gusto nilang umalis kasi bina-violate yung conditions ng contract, yung employer mismo. Mababa ang sahod or hindi sang-ayon sa kontrata nung umalis sila. Kasi pagdating sa Amerika, binabago pa yung kontrata na minsan sa Department of Labor, alam natin na dumadaan yun sa polo, nire-review yung contract, pero pagdating doon, hindi na umaabot ulit. Kaya yung aming warning lang sa mga nurses na gustong pumunta sa Amerika, basahin niyo po ang inyong kontrata. Read your contract well. Ngayon hanggat maaari, tignan niyo yung issue ng liquidated damages. Ideally, we want these liquidated damages to be removed. Dahil meron pong desisyon yan po ay salungat sa tinatawag nating public policy. Bakit salungat sa public policy? Kasi hindi mo pwedeng itali, no, ang isang nurse ng 3 taon o 5 taon sa kontrata kung ang violation halimbawa is on the part of the employer. At ang kalakaran o ang batas sa Amerika at sa Pilipinas is you can notify the employer because it's an employment at will, pwede kang umalis. No? Ganito din sa Pilipinas, 30 days. Pero task force namin, there is a balancing of interest para maproteksyonan din ang employer at employee. So doon pumapasok ngayon yung reimbursement for actual costs, for example, of the employer. Pero ang mahalaga sa natin is importante, it's very, very important that when you review the contract, you should ask also the advice of an attorney if you have one. I know it's very difficult when it comes to an employment contract where everybody is interested to leave this country and just go to the United States because of the promise of employment. But the moment you arrive in the United States, it's not as rosy as you think. As you experience later on, there are different adjustments. And in that adjustment, based on the cases that we have handled, we have successfully negotiated, for example, that liquidated damages from 30,000 be reduced to 5,000.
You have index cards and some questions that are starting to come up. I'd like to invite 2 additional people to come up and help us answer questions along with the panelists. Dr. Arnedo Valera from the Board of Nursing. She has introduced comprehensive nursing bill and special temporary permanent training for nurses. In addition, Dr. Glenda Arquiza is the chairperson of the Professional Regulatory Board of Nursing and the Professional Regulatory Commission. And while we wait for more questions to come in, I just want to step back and mention, what is the point of this panel? We're talking about a new paradigm for professional recruitment. What's the old paradigm? The old paradigm is one where people are seeking a better life and a better job, but there's confusion throughout the process. They don't know what they're signing. It's hard to get initial understanding of what your contract provisions are. And there might be steps in the process where there's discrimination, where there's unfair treatment. The new paradigm is a shift where there's understanding, where there are clear checklists so that nurses can be powerful and understand what their rights are, understand what their obligations are. It's one where nurses don't have to worry about discrimination and where they're treated in the same way as others. And if they're in a job that's bad, that their breach fees are reasonable and able to not keep them in positions they don't want to be.
And that means that they're essentially, that could be human trafficking, but at the very least, they're being coerced into signing the contract. And so under the law in most states, that contract is no longer valid. Also, I think Attorney Valera was mentioning this too, but if the hospital doesn't abide by the contract, then the contract is broken, generally. And the nurse then doesn't have to abide by the contract anymore. So all of this is to say that in most of these situations that Attorney Valera was describing, the nurse should not have to pay, shouldn't have to pay a cent to the hospital or the employer because the contract is usually invalid. That said, it's really hard to get free legal services as a defendant in a case. And so I think the idea of a legal fund would be helpful. It's different from if you're a plaintiff and an attorney would be willing to work for free because you might be recovering some money. As a defendant, you're probably not going to recover any money. And so it's difficult for many nurses who can't afford a lawyer, and therefore it's either the decision between paying legal fees, which could amount to a lot of money very quickly, or just paying a little bit of money to the hospital. Legally, they shouldn't have to pay anything, but unfortunately that's the situation that we have in most of the United States.
Now, I just want to add something. There is a Nassau Supreme Court case relative to liquidated damages, where they said that when a Filipino nurse signed a contract, they are in a take it or leave it position. They are not in equal footing with staffing agencies that would allow the nurses to agree and disagree as to what would be included in the contract. In other words, what this decision says is there is no real bargaining between the staffing agencies and the nurses whose livelihoods are at stake. That's the reason why when the nurse wanted to terminate that contract, the livelihood is at stake. So you are not, and you're not supposed to be prohibited to terminate that contract and try to disqualify you or tie you for a period of 3 to 5 years. And they said that liquidated damages are unenforceable, hindi pwedeng ipatupad because they are contrary to public policy, salungat po sa publiko polisiya.
I'd like to start with a question from the audience. Nurses still working under contractual terms in government hospitals for years and then not getting hired full time. What's your take on it? Nurses are often still working under contractual terms in government hospitals for many years, and they still aren't getting hired full time. Is there a take on this that you have?
I think the question pertains to Philippine nurses, where most of them are in a contractual basis. Right?
Yeah, this is a problem right now, where especially in the LGU hospitals, wherein nurses are hired on job order. And they have been working for years and they do not become regular. There is already a Department of Health order, that job order, also from the Department of Labor, that job order is not allowed. It is supposed to be illegal. Even the end of contract is a very big issue right now with the nurses, no? Because most of them are on contractual terms.
Sasabihin ko na rin po, alam niyo po mahilig ako sa pro bono advisor ako ng Presidential Communications Office and with Secretary Lorenzana. But we spoke about this contract yung tinatawag natin contractualization relative sa Department of Labor. Yan po ay ititigil na, malapit na po siyang itigil, and they want to regularize all employees. Pangako po yan. That's a promise of President Duterte. I gave a memorandum to Malacanang regarding contractualization, and it will end soon.
That is a good news, sir. But as I said, the Department of Labor has already issued a memorandum regarding this, or even the Department of Health. Dr. Dublago.
For those based in the Philippines, maybe you have seen this over the TV or heard this over the radio that a week or 2 weeks ago, there are 2,500 nurses under the DOH hospitals that will be terminated. And this is very lamentable, but with this new memorandum, maybe this will be addressed accordingly.
And just as a follow-up segue, we have a couple questions regarding Philippines. What is the government doing to regulate salary and benefits of nurses working in private hospitals? This is the case of equalization.
The salaries of the private employees are under the Department of Labor and Employment. So for the government hospitals, the standardized salary is in place. So there are not much problem for the government-owned hospitals, at least the DOH retained hospitals. But like the problem is more for the private hospitals. But most of the private hospitals, big hospitals, follow the salary also. I mean, at least the minimum wage salary.
Thank you. This question is, I guess, for Arnedo. Is there hiring in the U.S. as of now? I believe there is none because there are nursing graduates produced by U.S. schools. When do you think the active hiring from back in the 1980s will come back?
As you're aware, when nurses with license both in the Philippines and in the U.S. are hired by U.S. employers, they arrive there as permanent residents or green card holders. The reason for that is RNs, registered nurses, are pre-certified. So in other words, they don't go through the process of advertising and recruitment. But there is a backlog, there is a waiting period. So they are classified as a skilled and professional under the immigration category. And for the last 33 years that I have been practicing immigration law, this is now the main problem. The hiring, potential hiring, continues. Why? Because I represent a lot of nurses as well, and some agencies, for example, who files immigrant visa petitions, but the waiting period right now is about 3 years or so. Now, can the employer file an H-1B or specialty occupation for nurses. If you recall, there is a change in the requirement. To be an H-1B, you have to have a bachelor's degree, or it is required to have a bachelor's degree. The job demands a bachelor's degree in nursing. But right now, the change is, even if you have 2 years associate degree in the United States, you can take the licensure exams. So in other words, it's not required anymore for somebody to have a bachelor's degree. That's why they don't hire H-1B applicants coming from the Philippines. Except, which we did this by experience in our law practice, if you have 5 years of experience in your job, and it's a specialty, neonatal, surgery, emergency, all this, then there are employers that would find a way for you for the H-1B petition. But H-1B, that allows you to be in the United States in 3 to 5 months, right now there is a limitation, there is a quota. And under President Trump's policy, it is now very, very strict. So what is now the navigation lane to follow? Well, if you can wait for 3 to 5 years, and you have employers, potential employers in the United States, then ask them to file immediately an immigrant petition. And it's just a waiting time. But they wanted to hire, and I know that there remains a critical shortage of nurses, especially in the States. Several states that are considered as health professional shortage areas. But the immigration navigation lanes are very restrictive.
So I'll just add a little bit more detail to what Attorney Valera just said. That the way that it generally works in immigration law is that there are per country caps on different visa categories. And this is a little bit of a side note. This is a side note, but many of you know that Filipinos rely heavily on family-based immigration, and that right now is being discussed in Congress. And there is very much desire among many politicians, including the president, to weaken family-based immigration. Filipinos really rely on those categories, especially, for example, one category where you can bring, a U.S. citizen can bring their brother or sister to the U.S. That's the category where Filipinos have a 25-year wait. That's the longest out of anyone in the country. That category, for example, is at risk. I'm just going to say that if you're from the U.S., I encourage you to call Congress and make a quick call and say that we want to protect all of those categories. Back to nursing migration, though, I just checked the visa bulletin, which is something that's publicly available that all of you can check, for EB3, which is the category that nurses generally come to the U.S. under. The priority date is October 2016 right now, which means that it's about a 1.5 to 2 year wait for most nurses coming from the Philippines. It has been worse in the past. This is actually not that bad. But it does mean that there is nurse hiring going on in the U.S. There still is a nursing shortage in the U.S. Unfortunately, as Attorney Valera was saying, it's the immigration backlog, and that's the bottleneck in the situation.
That is why, if I were you, the EB3 category will be the best route. So waiting period, 1.5 to 2 years, get an employer, have that approved, and just simply wait. In the meantime, you can gain experience in hospitals here. And I believe there has to be really a cooperation with the PNAA and the PNA and other organizations here. For example, that while waiting for 1.5 to 2 years period, at least we are able to address the issue of what you call, and the issue of sameness in terms of the equivalency of experience. I think you get it.
I wish to go back to the question a while ago. What is the government doing to regulate salary and benefits of nurses working in private hospitals? This is to be given priority. Well, we have a pending nursing bill now in the Senate, which was vetoed by the previous administration. it reached the table of President Aquino. But unfortunately, the association, the Hospital Association of the Philippines published a an article in the newspapers requesting the president to veto the bill. And this was followed by a personal letter by the former Secretary of Health, also to veto the nursing bill. We were fortunate to have the nursing bill reach the table of President Aquino, but unfortunately it was vetoed. So we are back to square one. Yesterday, I am the oversight of the nursing bill. Yesterday I was in the Senate. I had an audience with Senator Trillanes, who is the main sponsor of the nursing bill, and he promised to again support us with this. And this time, the salaries of the government, nurses, the salaries of the nurses in the private hospitals will be included. So for the government, the private nurses, hopefully we will have an entry salary grade of salary 15, which is equivalent to 24,000 plus. That would be the entry for both nurses in the government and private hospitals. So let us pray that this time, since the Speaker a while ago said President Duterte pledged to support and increase the salary of our Filipino nurses based in the Philippines.
So we have a lot of questions.
Bakshi, just one more point. I think this is just the right time. The PNAA in the Philippines, you try to seek audience with President Duterte and demand it. Gawin nyo na po yan. And incidentally, I don't know if the Philippine nurses are aware, last September of this year, meron pong department order, ang Department of Labor, requiring shorter hours and 2 days off for nurses and other health workers in private medical centers. So tingnan nyo po yan, reviewin nyo yan. That was issued last September.
This is the new working condition policy of the DOLE, that there will no longer be a 12-hour duty in the hospital, because the claim is that it will affect tremendously the health of our nurses and other health allied workers. So we are back to 8 hours.
So another question, I'm going to try to bundle a couple because there's so many. The next question is around contracts. So the first part is, you mentioned 2 separate contracts for nurses. Can that be legitimate? Like a first contract is from the recruiter and the second contract is from the employer? And the second linked question is, do registered nurses from the Philippines stay with certain agencies when they are hired in the U.S. And then get a lesser rate because they have to pay fees? Around contract policy.
So there are several related-ish questions here. Can nurses, could it ever be legitimate when there are 2 separate contracts, when they're hired in the U.S.? First contract from the recruiter, second contract from the employer. It's hard, all of these things are very dependent on the particular facts of the situation, but I would just say that more likely than not in this situation, there is an element of coercion probably at play. like we both said, often when a nurse gets to the U.S. and is presented with a new contract with different terms, she doesn't really feel like she has a choice but to sign. And so there are a lot of possible ways in which that contract that they sign in the U.S. is no longer valid. So I'll leave it at that. And then in terms of the permanent resident question, this is going back to what we were talking about earlier as well. It depends, your path to a green card in the U.S. depends on what visa category you came under. So under the EB3, the employment-based visas, you come with a green card, essentially. With other categories like the H-1B, you actually have to adjust and apply for a green card later on. So that's a little bit more complicated in those situations. With some visa categories like H-2Bs that don't really apply to nurses so much, but many Filipinos rely on them anyway, it's generally not possible to go from an H-2B straight to a green card.
Let me first address the question, can nurses have two separate contracts when they are hired in the US? One from the recruiter and one from the employer. Alam niyo po, this is a potential labor trafficking case. Because we have this type of cases where a particular nurse had a contract with the recruiter where a certain amount of his or her salary is being deducted from the paycheck. Labor trafficking po yan, bawal po yan. So what you need to do is make sure to review who is taking care of the payment of salaries. Why would there be a need for two contracts? Now, just remember that it is also a business. But I have seen a lot of contracts, as mentioned in this question, where there are two. One from the recruiter and one from the employer. And this is highly suspect. So you have to be very careful of this. Now, what about the RNs from the Philippines staying with certain agency when they are hired in the US and they take lesser rate because they have to pay fees? Do RNs stay with certain agency? Well, if you arrive in the US, you're already a permanent resident, you're already green card. You do not have an obligation to stay with that agency. Now, if you think that the salary you have been receiving is less than what is stated in your contract, then you can challenge that. You can go to the local Department of Labor agency in the United States and look at that because it's a violation of the labor standards. And we have seen cases like that. Now, do not be afraid to challenge it because they cannot take away your green card because it is based on a legitimate job offer when you left the Philippines. So they cannot take that out. So wag po tayong matakot yung sinasabi nila. When you leave the premises of my agency, then we will report you to the INS. No, you can report them to the INS. You can report them to the INS.
Excellent, thank you. For Dr. Glenda Arquiza.
Sorry, can I just say, respectfully, please don't talk to INS. Talk to a lawyer first, please. Especially with this administration, you could be putting yourself at risk if you're not a citizen. Do not go to the government, to immigration by yourself. Talk to a lawyer first. That said, depending on your state, if you, in California, for example, you don't necessarily need a lawyer to go to the Department of Labor, and they're actually very welcoming to people just coming without a lawyer. And in those situations, especially in states like California that have been made it clear that immigrants are welcome, you can feel free to do that without a lawyer. But do not go to federal immigration without the advice of a lawyer.
The next question is for Dr. Glenda Arquiza. How do you address the issue of concurrency of the nursing curriculum? Address the issue of concurrency.
Our nursing curriculum is a competency-based, community-oriented curriculum. But beginning June 2018, we have a new curriculum, which is outcomes-based education. but which is actually a competency-based curriculum also. So we are still using the 2009 curriculum.
Thank you. This is a quick question. Do the Philippine nurses have collective bargaining? I believe it's for the U.S.
Yeah, the curriculum is composed of didactic and clinical, or theoretical and clinical, which the clinical we call it related learning experience. Yeah, I know there are issues regarding the concurrency of the didactic and the clinical, which I think has been addressed. This is an issue especially in California.
Thank you.
So I think the other question was whether nurses in the U.S. have collective bargaining rights. Every worker in the U.S. has the right to join a union if they desire. That said, there needs to be a union in place in order for you to join it. But it's also your right to organize a union. That can be a lot of work, and but that said, that there are lots of very enthusiastic and very helpful unions in major cities, especially in Los Angeles and New York. Nursing unions are very strong. But that said, it depends on your particular hospital, particular workplace. But across the United States, all workers and all nurses have the right to collective bargaining. But there are steps that might have to be taken if a union is not organized.
And a last question is, what is your take on nursing employment in Southeast Asia amidst ASEAN integration? I don't know if anybody has to say that. ASEAN is In the meanwhile, I'll ask another question. Is what about nurses who leave their employer without notice at night or any time? Can you enforce liquidated damages clauses if the employee just leaves your job?
So that it really depends on the facts of the situation. And also might depend on the state that you're in. But that said, if the employer, generally in the U.S. at least, if the employer has violated the contract already, you can leave. There's no more contract in place generally, and so you can leave at any time. You don't have to give them any notice whatsoever, and you would not be held liable for liquidated damages. That's if you went all the way to court and all the way to trial or all the way to a judge, basically. The problem, as we were saying earlier, though, is that it's expensive to hire lawyers, and so sometimes it's just financially better for a nurse to pay a couple $1,000s as a settlement, even though legally she shouldn't have to.
So let me repeat this question. What is your take? What is your take in nursing employment in Southeast Asia amidst Asian integration? I think it's not only ASEAN, but all over the world. If you look at globally, what you call benefit of pursuing an independent foreign policy is that you take the paramount national interest of your constituents, which means what President Duterte is doing is to establish relations with all countries, regardless of ideology, because we need to generate jobs, we need to invite investments. So my take on this is, I'm pretty sure that it will increase the potential hiring of several nurses, not only with ASEAN, but with other countries. In fact, Secretary Bello was talking about Germany as a model, and basically, hopefully we can move on a transition where nurses in the Philippines don't have to take exams again in other countries, so long as there is what you call a sameness of curriculum. But I believe in ASEAN that is more realistic as of now.
We have what you call the ASEAN Coordinating Committee on Nursing. And we are now in the process of harmonizing the 10 the curriculum of the 10 member states of the ASEAN Economic Community. So we just had the last meeting last week, and we are aligning the curriculum, the competencies of the nurses belonging to the ASEAN, the 10 member states.
Thank you. Can I invite Jula Pakwa to make some comments? Can we, meanwhile, give another hand of applause to our wonderful panelists and our wonderful
Vicky Navarro just asked me to make a comment on this concurrency. Please understand that the competency, what we call clinical application of educational aspect of nursing education must be done concurrent. The greatest exception perhaps that you might see is that when students, for example, in community health nursing, may choose to go abroad to do their clinical, but it is always almost within or following that semester when the educational component is given. So when you deal with competencies of educational programs, I think this has to be considered, because at every point in time you have to look at what competencies you're looking.
Yes, this has been a problem from 2005 to 2011 when the mass